Okay. All right. I think maybe we can get started, and anyone who joins a minute later, that will be fine. Welcome, everyone. This is going to be the third workshop on data management. We do not need to attend these workshops in a consecutive manner. You can learn from them independently. Um, so let's get started. So I wanted to start with a couple of ground rules so we can all hopefully learn the most of this workshop. One important thing is this meeting is being recorded for YouTube so that anyone who couldn't attend today will be able to watch all the content later, and it will also have a DOI. So to make most of this workshop, I'm hoping we can all agree to minimize distractions. We really hope you will be fully present because part of this workshop is interactive, which also means that we really want you all to participate. The other thing is that we really hope that everyone will, share their experiences and share ideas and suggestions. And in this room, we will set the expectation that silence means agreement. Another thing that we're hoping is, that everyone has this space to contribute and that no one will be silent. So we ask everyone to explain their situations and solutions and ideas as concise as possible because our time is always limited. If you think you have a lot of background noise, please keep yourself on mute. We would really like to get to know each other as a BII community or a community of researchers interested in data management. And so please identify yourself when you speak so we can get to know your name and maybe hopefully get to know you a little bit. And as you may know, I am joined by my three wonderful co-presenters, and they will be monitoring the chat. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. Also, we really want this to be a community where we can learn from each other. So if you have any resources or recommendations or ideas, this is a great space to share that, even if one of the presenters is sharing some information with you. So I would like to briefly introduce to you our RCN, or Research Coordination Network. And that is part of an NSF-funded program under the Biology Integration Institutes that we all come from. And what our goal is with this specific NSF grant is to build for you a comprehensive toolkit for interdisciplinary team science and really think about how things may have context-dependent application, like maybe how things may be different for early career researchers or people in specific disciplines or specific types of institutions. And so this grant is led by several of the BIIs, including Emerge, from which Suzanne, Verena, and I are, Embryo, Broaden, BPRI, MCA, and Ascend, from who that is representing. But there are many RCNs that we very interactively work with to make this toolkit better, and from whom we seek a lot of advice and recommendations and input. So what is going to be in this toolkit? So in the broader picture, we will be sharing some documents about how to best govern a BII and what kind of infrastructure you may need. Data management, which we're talking about today. We're also sharing a lot of team science tools, which are mostly developed by Verena and myself, science communication outreach, diversity, equity and inclusion, mentorship, as well as evaluation. We really hope to share these resources permanently for all, mature and newer BIIs and researchers in general that can benefit from these tools. I thought we had a slide on who we are. Maybe we don't.
Oh, I think if you go back to go back one more back.
Here we are. Yeah. I'm very sorry. I forgot to introduce my co-presenters today. Suzanne, would you briefly introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Suzanne Hodgkins. I'm the data manager with the Emerge BII and kind of leading the like the content preservation presentation for this workshop series. So I bring kind of the data management expertise to it.
Suzanne is really the expert, so be friends with her. My name is Anmuk. I'm a senior team scientist at the Institute for Research in the Social Sciences in Colorado State, and I work very intensely with the Immerse BII. I'm joined by Brett. Brett, can you introduce yourself?
I am Dr. Brett Fredrickson. I'm the managing director of the Ascend BII, and I send you all the emails about these workshops. And
And I'm
Verena.
also joined by Verena.
Hello, everyone. My name is Verena Knerich, which may be confusing to everyone who has heard about the BII Verena. At least I always get startled when I hear people supposedly talking about me. I am a PhD candidate at Colorado State University in the Department of Sociology, and my dissertation is actually concerned with a lot of the team science conversations of very large cross-disciplinary teams, such as the BIIs. So I'm bringing the team science perspective to this workshop.
Great. So now you all know who we are, and hopefully don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions or want to network. And so we know that we're working with a lot of data in our research, and associated with that, we have like a lot of tasks. And one of the things that we often struggle with, at least in a lot of the teams that I've been working with, and we're getting better and better, so we'll try to share the resources with you, is really like who is going to be responsible for doing what? And how can we make sure that everyone is on one page of the many tasks that are associated with it? And especially if you are in a larger team and there's more people involved, the easier it becomes for things to be complex. So some of the tasks that we have been thinking about associated with data management is really like who's generating the data, who's processing the data, who is making sure like it's stored for a long time and that our databases are maintained, who is making sure like our data is secure and not shared with people who are not supposed to get access to it, and who is sharing the data, who's checking for the errors in the data, who is standardizing the metadata, who's sharing it with the team, and who's sharing it with the public. Obviously, this is not a comprehensive list, but it is a list that I think covers a good amount of data management tasks associated with bigger teams. So how can we do this well in teams? I would like to learn from you a little bit about what strategies your teams uses to clarify who's responsible for what in data management. You may have very clear things to point to. You may also be questioning by yourself, like, I'm not really sure. I think this person is good at it. I can probably go to them, but I'm not sure if there's like an official like responsibility assigned to that person. So some of the questions that we would like you to discuss in breakout rooms is what has been your experience with data management? Is it working or maybe not entirely working in your team? To what extent are you familiar with the broader structure of data management responsibilities on your team and your responsibilities within this structure? And what are some of the strengths and weaknesses of what's happening in your team now? And I know we may all be in like different types of teams. Some of you may be in BIIs, some of you may be in subgroups, some of you may be in a lab working with a couple of people or working on a specific paper. So any of those, groups where you share and work together on data are appropriate about thinking about these topics. So I think we're going to go in breakout rooms for maybe about 7 or 8 minutes. Brett, would you like to open the breakout rooms?
Hello, welcome back, everyone. And welcome back.
Welcome back, everyone. So
Hi.
I would love to hear a little bit about the things that you have been talking about in your groups. I cannot actually see the groups right now. Oh, wait. Yeah, maybe we can just start with group 1, which is actually a group that I joined. Heidi and Juan. Is there anyone who would like to summarize maybe some of the things that we have discussed in our group?
Well, hi there. This is Juan. I work with Ascend. So I think some of the things we discussed was like, yeah, like there's a level of complexity, and yeah, like there are like different sizes of teams, and and you have to keep like this communication also. Like there's an important technical part about it, which is uh, knowing what kind of code, or yeah, like how data management is working for a particular person, and then someone else come with an idea trying to update or integrating things, and that can make can be kind of disruptive. So those are a bit of things that I can catch about what we just discussed.
Yeah, I think that's great. We also heard a couple of things about code and like, well, working in codes and that can be changed. That's something that I've also faced in the past. So a lot of struggles are associated with that. I see the second room. It seems like only Pamela is in there. Pamela, are you willing
So our
to?
group 2 was actually Jill, Nigel, Sarah, and Tanya.
Oh, okay. Can we? Yeah. Who would like to share?
I can go for it, and anyone from that team can speak out. So I'm Nigel Golden, part of the Evome BII. A couple of us in the breakout session are part of BIIs that are very brand new, and so right, so we're being introduced to all of the data management challenges. So one that was brought up was about sharing data across institutions due to varying institutional policies surrounding data sharing. Another thing was exploring methods for organizing and sharing data subsets universally amongst the team, especially when different teams have shared needs that need to be used in a way. And then one of the things that I appreciated hearing at the end by Jill was about iterative data refinement, right? So potentially starting small, refining the data structures that do work, and iterating based on those shared experiences.
Great. Thank you. Those are very good recommendations. How about room 4, which is Andy, Mariana. I just added Pamela and Uhunwa. Please correct me if I mispronounce your name.
I think it's Precious.
Oh, Precious. Sorry.
Well, what I noticed, or what I was sharing with our group is that I have been like for 2 years in a VII. It's like, well, our gaps in our knowledge is that, for example, when you enter in a new institute, there is another complicated way to manage that. There is no like a global way to manage data, no? So that can be complicated if you move from one institution to another. Just you need to learn again and again how to manage data. For example, in Ascend, I think one of our weakness is that we recently moved, well, part of the team moved from one institution to another. And in the new institution, we don't have like a way, like a cloud or a system to store that data. And some of us don't have access to the data that was left in the other institutions. So I think that is a big problem because storing data is really expensive. And what happens when you move from one institution to another? You lost data, you
Yeah.
and I think always like be prepared and store data in different ways, like not only in like a server or in the cloud, because it can be lost, but
That
so
sounds really
have
tricky,
different
right?
copies.
Because often I do the same thing. I have some on my SharePoint, some on my email sometimes, and you know, you may lose all those things very easily.
Yeah.
Move things. Yeah, that's a great point. And we also talked a little bit about the previous time. So I think I will hand it over to my great co-presenter and friend, Suzanne.
Good. Thank you. So I will talk about kind of the broad tasks and things to consider when you're thinking about data management at a team and institutional level, which can be your university or your BII or other large project. So communicating across your team is important, especially in large teams, because if you're not communicating well, then sometimes problems can arise, such as lack of coherence in research goals. So like maybe not all the sub-teams have the same kind of research question in mind, which isn't always a problem, but can sometimes lead to sort of disjointed research efforts, especially if there's multiple teams kind of contributing different things to the same research project. Another big problem is losing track of how results were derived. So let's say one team generates a bunch of sequence data and then sends it off to another team who then does a bunch of bioinformatics on it and comes up with a bunch of genomes, but somewhere in that process, the information on which genome came from which sample was lost, and so that can be a big problem, not only for interpreting data, but when you're trying to submit to NCBI or other external repositories. Another thing that can happen is duplication of the same analyses. So two teams that kind of independently come up with the same kind of question and are doing the same analysis to answer that, but then they can't both publish their papers, because then whoever gets there first kind of gets credit for doing it, but then whoever did not get there first, they no longer have like the novelty of their project. So communication can avoid all these things. Some other misunderstandings that communication is important for avoiding are just kind of misunderstanding each other's work. So this can be mistranslations between metadata schemes. So maybe like what the meaning of the word, say grassland, for instance, might be subtly different between your team and someone else's team. And so the same research site might be labeled like a prairie by one group and a grassland by another, for instance. Misinterpreting each other's results. So a common way this happens is across disciplines. So say one group is presenting a bunch of relative abundance data of different microbes analyzed by 16S sequencing, where the relative abundances really, they're very relative, but then like say another group of geochemists might just see those and think, oh, this microbe A is more abundant than microbe B, but really it's just the technique is more sensitive to microbe A. So it's important to communicate those kinds of caveats, and then also not grasping the time commitment and complexity of each other's work. So this cartoon kind of illustrates that. So especially with things like using machine learning, what is simple to our eyes might not be simple to a machine. So like, let's say someone wants to build an app that looks at nature photos, and it should check whether it's in a national park. Well, it turns out, even though you might not know this if you don't already know how photos are stored, but photos on most devices have a geotag, so it's easy to look up the location. But checking whether the photo is of a bird, even though it's easy for us to do, just looking at it, having a computer do that is very difficult. So it takes a research team and 5 years. I don't know, maybe not anymore now that there's advancements in AI, but this is the kind of thing where like not having discipline expertise can really kind of make it harder to understand what it takes for different research teams to do their work if you're not already if you're not communicating about it. So one tool that teams can use to improve communication is project data policies. So these are a governance tool that the purpose is to guide how data management is implemented across a large team. So this is an example from the Emerge BII, and there's a link here where you can look at it if you're more interested. But in the next few slides, I'll be going over at least some of the topics that are covered in here or that could be included in it. But these topics are going to be important to think about regardless of whether you have a data policy that spells them out. So one component of communication that might be spelled out in a data policy is shared vocabulary. So this can include many different things. So sample metadata, such as standardized sample IDs, site names, dates, depths, etc. Data quality levels. So this is kind of the definition of data quality spelled out in the Emerge data policy, but I've also seen kind of a similar system used by other databases where 0 is kind of the most unprocessed, and then with progressive error correction and polishing, it goes up to quality 2, which is data that you can really just kind of look at and draw scientific conclusions from. Versions, I talked about semantic versioning in some previous workshops, but it's just a well-defined system of defining versions of code or data or really anything. Another thing that's not on here is just like what I mean, I guess it goes sort of to sample metadata, but like when one person uses a term such as even just the word data or metadata, does everyone across the team mean the same thing with those words? So getting clarity on those things is important. Shared infrastructure. So this touches on several of the data management tasks that we outlined right before the breakout. So some elements of a connected data infrastructure include storage, database, processing code, or web portal. And different projects may have different configurations of these things, but this is kind of the schematic of the most common way that these things are organized at a very basic level, where you have storage where the actual files are stored. So like a storage drive. It's a database that sort of organizes information about those data sets, where they're located, what they are. And then there's things like processing code that both accesses the data and might produce outputs that then feed back into the storage. And a web portal, which also takes data from storage and then shares it out with either the team or the public. So some things to consider here are to avoid redundancy of similar components of your infrastructure, to avoid different versions of the same data ending up being created because there's different copies and different people working on each copy. Of course, it is still important to have like a backup of your data, but ideally there should only be one storage location that people are using to actually edit and add files. Another thing to consider is who needs access and what levels, which might be built into the web portal or the database, depending on how your project is structured. So when you're processing data, this is not always thought of as a part of data management, because usually researchers are kind of doing their own data processing, may or may not be communicating with a data management team while doing it. But it's still important to track what happened, because as mentioned earlier, you can lose track of where a given derived data product came from if you don't track your processing steps. So having all your processing in scripts to make it reproducible is great, as opposed to like copying and pasting between different Excel files and then you don't know why this number changed. So Git is a useful tool not for tracking different versions of your code as you're working on it. So if you're, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but if not, you can check out this resource that I've linked in this slide, which maybe someone can paste in the chat to get started. And there's a lot of tutorials out there, so this is just one of them. So some best practices when you're working on code is to share your code so that others can see what you did. Add documentation, both like in comments above specific lines of code that might be confusing, but also just like on a broader level, making README files to just explain on a high level what your code does is good. And then also invite others to contribute so they can spot errors. So in this figure, there's this uses some Git terminology, which includes branches. So a branch is what it sounds like. It's where you're you have different branching versions of your code. So maybe one person is working on one set of edits and someone else is working on another set. And then say you're working on adding a particular analysis to like a long processing pipeline. And then and then when you're done, you would create a pull request, which is basically a request to merge it with with the main version of the code. But as you're doing that, someone who might be a reviewer, one of your colleagues, kind of tracking the whole process might say, hey, I found an error. And then you can say, oh, great, thank you. Here's a correction. And that's all, that can all be done within the like GitHub merge. Like there's like a whole pull request comment section thing that if you use GitHub, it'll you'll see how to use it. That's very useful for this kind of thing. And then once the errors are corrected, then it can be merged with the main code version. I'm probably spending too much time on each slide, so I'll go through the rest quickly, or try to. So when you're sharing data within a team, it's important to not lose track of who to credit for that data. So when you're sharing data, if it's if there were other people who helped with it, you want to make sure to credit them when you're sharing that data with other sub-teams. And then when you're using someone else's data, be sure to give credit to the data generators. And this is especially true if you're sharing your results publicly. And if you're not sure who generated the data, then contact the person who shared it with you. Some other things you might want to consider are timelines and for data sharing and procedures. So some questions to consider are like, what's the need for sharing with different groups, such as your lab group, the broader project team, and the public. And these timelines can depend on the time frame of manuscript submission, because manuscripts usually require you to share your data. Another thing to know is whether your project has an established sharing pipeline. Some groups, such as eMERGE, have like an established pipeline to submitting to like a data curator who handles all the sharing. And I'll show that on the next slide. And then also another thing to consider is what happens if someone has an important data set and they leave the project. So this is why it's important to have important data sets be accessible by more than one person. So here is, I'll be showing kind of a schematic of how the data management life cycle in eMERGE works. So this is spelled out in eMERGE's data policy, which I shared earlier. So the color key, so this flowchart is going to be coded by the responsibilities of project members in yellow and the database team in blue. So project members do their science and generate their data. And then they define the quality of that data and match them to a set of standardized sample IDs that we have, and then submit it to the database team. And then once the database team receives that data, we then make sure the metadata all looks good and add it to our database. And so in addition to our database, we also have this Globus sequencing data store, which is kind of for more kind of ad hoc sharing of large files that are maybe still being processed and not ready for final archiving yet. So this is a redundancy, but like sometimes like having some redundancy is unavoidable. So it's not always perfect. And then the eMERGE database links out to external repositories where the data is shared with the public in perpetuity. And then also, it also includes links to our internal data store. And then this integrated structure allows researchers to then do new analyses based on existing data, which is in this unified structure. So doing all of this is a challenge because it's a huge web of tasks, and it's too much for one person to keep track of all of it. So this is again why communication and teamwork are important. So even though it's tempting, it's best not to fall into the trap of feeling like you need to be responsible or consulted on everything, or just doing it your own way because you don't understand the team strategy. So this is why it's important to assign different people different roles for various tasks. I will now pass it to Verena, who will explain a framework for doing that.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Suzanne, for this really helpful overview. So as promised, we're now going to dive a little bit into some of the team science material, which will hopefully help all of you with your data management needs on teams. As Suzanne was saying, one of the really tricky things in managing data that is not solely our own is understanding what is it that I need to do and what is it that other people need to do, and who is ultimately accountable for what sort of actions. So the RACI matrix, next slide, please, is a framework that originates in the industry where it is really widely used across a large variety of teams. However, it is also really, really applicable and useful for any sort of teams, not just in the industry, because they share a lot of commonalities in the complexity of management tasks and information exchange that we all need to address. So maybe just as a quick temperature check of the room, who here has either heard of the RACI matrix before or maybe even used it? By show of hand. I see Jill. I see Nigel. But if I am not mistaken, Suzanne and Pamela. That's wonderful. So a few. So you feel free to chime in the chat if you want to share some of your experiences. We always love to learn from one another, as Anne was saying in the beginning. For everyone else, I'm going to briefly introduce the framework, which is fairly simple at the end of the day. So RACI stands for Responsible, Accountable, Consulted, and Informed. And the main idea to give a team common language to talk about who takes on what level of responsibility for what sort of task. The person responsible for the completion of a specific task is the one who is commonly the doer, so to speak. So for instance, I shared in the beginning, I'm a PhD candidate. I am the only person who needs to make sure that my dissertation gets done at the end of the day. I'm going to collect the data, I'm going to analyze it, and I need to write the dissertation. However, for the IRB, for instance, and general accountability, I am just a student. I'm not the one who has to bear the burden, luckily still, when things go wrong. For that, I am advised by my advisor, who is ultimately accountable for the IRB, for example, to make sure that what I'm doing is actually correct. But she's not the one doing the work. The person consulted is usually a person or several who do not carry out the task per se, but who possess expertise that can help in completing a specific task. So for instance, if I have data management needs, which I certainly will for my dissertation, I might go over to Suzanne and be like, hey, I know you're the expert. Could you please provide me some sort of input and some guidance maybe in making sure that I make the right choices moving forward in my dissertation? She's not the one doing it, but she can give me guidance. Informed parties are all of those people who need to be informed of important decisions or changes in the completion of a task. So if you picture in my example, once again, I have a range of committee members who do not need to be informed and kept up to date the same way my advisor does, who is the head of my committee, of everything that I'm doing. But if I change the scope, for example, of my dissertation, or I decide to take a different analytical strategy, they certainly need to be kept in the loop and informed. So this is just a basic overview of the 4 basic roles: responsible, accountable, consultant, and informed. Are there any questions before I move on? Silence means agreement, so I'm going to carry on. The way this works out, I know it feels perhaps a little bit fuzzy in the beginning, is you can actually use this to create a table overview of the tasks that are represented on your team. So on the left side, in the leftmost column, you can see a list of some of the tasks that may be relevant in a data management context. And then along the columns, you can see all of the people who may be relevant to carrying out these tasks. Then in each of the cells, you can see that one of the previous roles that I mentioned is represented. So for instance, in order to maintain the database, the PI may be ultimately accountable as per the original proposal, but the person who's doing the work is the data manager. The research assistants who provide the data need to be informed of how the data structure looks and how the database looks, but they are not the ones maintaining the database. In other instances, you may have The person who's ultimately responsible for carrying out the tasks, the research assistants, for instance, for maintaining the data quality level in conjunction with the data manager who's accountable for this task. Now, looking at this table, is there anything that we perhaps notice? Please note the example of how the tasks and the roles are distributed is just for the purpose of explaining how the framework works. I'm not saying this is the gold standard of how the roles should be distributed in a specific situation. It is solely as intended as an example. But is there anything that we are noticing?
The PI and co-PIs are accountable for almost everything.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely, which is what we do want. At the end of the day, they are the ones who wear the hat, so to speak. And if anything were to happen, they are the ones who need to provide answers. Brett, I saw you also raise your hand.
Not every column seems to have every classification in it as well.
Exactly. In addition, this is not represented in this example, but we could also imagine in the first row, for example, maintaining the database, that the community partners perhaps don't have any required role to fulfill. Maybe they don't even need to be consulted. Maybe they don't even need to be informed. They are all fair scenarios. So we're noticing PIs and co-PIs are often the ones accountable, and we do not need to have each role in each of the tasks, and not every person needs to have a role for each task. Anything else, maybe?
Cobb has said in the chat that somebody seems to be responsible for at least every task.
Yes, very good observation. Absolutely. We need somebody who does the job, otherwise it never gets done. Very good. Anything else anyone would like to share? Otherwise, don't worry, you'll get an opportunity to explore it further in a moment. Okay. So as promised, we created a little template for you with a RACI matrix. Someone is going to put it in the chat. Please download it for your own records and to fill it in a moment. We're going to give you some time where you can just work on it on your own. And you have 3 different steps that we are going to ask you to complete. The first one is try to identify some of the people who contribute to data management. Those go into the columns. You will see that we have already supplied you with a couple of examples. If they do not meet your specific context or setting, feel free to change them and customize them to your specific teaming scenario. Step 2 is fill in some of the tasks that you feel need to be included in the context or completed in the context of data management. Suzanne has already talked a lot about these and introduced some of the ones that we saw relevant in the beginning. Those were all of the blue bubbles, but maybe you are thinking of something else entirely that is relevant to you. Once again, we provided you with some examples in the leftmost column. Feel free, if they do not feel right for your team, to either add some or delete some that don't feel relevant. And then step 3, this is where the main heart of the RACI matrix really comes in, is fill in each of the cells, as you saw on the slide before, with a role that you feel like corresponds to this person and the task that needs to be completed. You will see, if you go to one slide, the next slide, please, Suzanne, just for a second. Thank you. This is what the template looks like that you're receiving just now in the chat. Thank you, Anne, for sending that along. So we're going to give you 5 minutes now just to work on it a bit on your own. Don't feel like you need to have a complete matrix. That takes way more time. We just want you to get a bit of a sense of how it could work. Please try to maybe fill in 2 tasks that are relevant to you, at least, in the entirety of that section. Are there any questions on how this works, or maybe any issues with getting the document? Still for providing visual feedback, always helpful. Okay, we're going to stay here in this main room while you work on that, so feel free to either use the chat or speak up if you run into any issues or questions. Okay, welcome back, everyone. We're going to do a brief share out, and I would really love to hear some of your observations in how it went. What did you perhaps notice? Did you have similar solutions? Maybe there were a lot of discrepancies. How hard or easy was it to fill in the cells and the columns and the rows, respectively? And did the thinking about this and talking about the tasks and responsibilities using the RACI framework change the conversation at all? And if so, how? Any volunteers for sharing? Yeah, Mariana, go ahead.
I think there is like a lot of differences between who is in charge, and because not every BII, like a data manager, a research assistant, sometimes a postdoc is also the data management manager for the team, and it's confusing.
Mhm. Can you say more about what is confusing?
Like sometimes you are responsible, but for generating the data, that could be easy, like is the undergrads, grad students, postdocs.
Mm.
But if the data manager, if you don't have like a data manager and a postdoc is also a data manager, what happens when he just leave?
Very good point. Very good point, Mariana. And I want you to hang on to this thought because I'm going to say something about this later. So I'm going to put a pin in that. So how does this help us if people just leave, especially if we don't have a dedicated person, such as a Suzanne, who's so wonderful for Emerge, but not all teams have the privilege of having a dedicated person being able to take on all of that. Yeah, absolutely. Other thoughts or observations?
Um,
Not necessarily from you, anyone who wants to share. Always hard online. It's hard to be concrete. Still,
Yeah, so I agree because there's like different roles and responsibilities and where it all sits. And then I found myself using the tool where still the director ended up with the R, the A, the C, and the I. Right? And it's like, well, maybe small a and big R and these kind of things. So it's like in varying degrees. And I had a hard time kind of representing that. So it could be maybe like if you think you've got these working groups and maybe these take, like as you're organizing your people is like you're going to take the lead on that. So you keep it going, but yet there might be some subgroups that do some smaller things and report back. And then that group reports to the bigger group. I don't know if there's some hierarchy here that could be captured. So that's where I was struggling. And I don't know
good
how
point
to,
also.
I'm playing around with bold or italic or letters to keep track of that. But
Will share that Suzanne had similar ideas, and when she went through this, and she's probably going to talk about it later when she presents her example regarding the director often ends up with a lot of the roles. That is something that we actually see very often. Partially, it comes with the job that the people who are in charge have their fingers in a lot of different areas and needs to be. But at the same time, as a team grows, especially, and we diversify our responsibilities, what we do want is to have that partition because we want to have somebody who's steering the whole ship, so to speak, but the captain can't be in all the different places at once. Maybe the person who's steering the ship should hand off some of the tasks where they can and where it makes sense so that other people can be trained over time to be the ones who are the doers, so the responsible people, for example. So it depends on the task and maybe on the time that the project is in, how big the team is, etc. But that is certainly something we see very often. So that would be one point I would make. Nigel, I see you raising your hand.
Yeah, one of the things that I thought about was when you brought up the community partners for like folks working in the Arctic, right? If you want to do research, now you need permission, right? If that work is going to impact any tribal resources, you need permission from the organization that are representing those tribal interests. And so one, right, like the tasks can get really complicated depending on like who the groups are that you're working with, but also thinking about how can you integrate principles as part of this framework, right? So if you're working with indigenous groups, you can use care principles, collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. And how do you fit that into this framework?
I love that. That is certainly a very important point to consider for how to be respectful with community partners and also team members at large, right? We don't necessarily just want to assign roles. Well, obviously, because you are person X or in position X, that is automatically what you're required to do. The idea of the framework also is to enable a team to collectively use the resources, which is very often time or competency, to the benefit of the team. So who is best suited to do what? And as Mariana was saying before, maybe there's a better solution for figuring out who does data management other than putting all of the accountability or the responsibility on a postdoc. Maybe there are opportunities to diversify it and spread it a bit if not every team has a Suzanne. And I'm sorry, Suzanne, for always using you as an example, but it just suits so perfectly. Are there any other things we want to get off our chest before we move on? I'm not missing anyone because my screen is small. So do speak up if you want to say something if I don't see you. I'm not hearing anything. Yeah.
I just like have a suggestion, and I think data management has changed a lot in the last years. So for me, like the better solution, we all are responsible to sharing the data, no? And because, and to have like a good way to represent the data that even if we are not there in that team anymore, you can easily find out what is data, no? Because I have been working with data that was taken 20 years ago. So the one
maintained data, loving that.
Yeah. So the only one who can give me the data is on the database, but the only one that can inform me about which data is good for one analysis is my PI, because she was responsible generating the data. So I cannot ask anyone else than her.
Very good point to raise, that to consider the longevity of data that doesn't just live during the duration of our project, but ideally is generated obviously also for generations to come. I will refer back to the data policy that Suzanne was mentioning before. That is certainly a component that can be considered there, because, and now I'm coming back, Suzanne, could you move on to the next slide? Thank you. What is it all that we can use the RACI framework potentially for? Originally, I said it is great to create role clarity for all team members. So we may be aware of that tacitly, but it may not be stated explicitly. So I am not accountable for something, for example, or I just want to be informed. So using the RACI framework, introducing it as a team to your team by using the same language can be very helpful just to gain that clarity at the team level. It's also helpful if you think back about some of the things that Suzanne was presenting. Who even needs access rights to some things? Maybe not every person needs the same level of access rights to every part of the data. Maybe for some things you just need to have viewing rights. For other things you may need to have editing rights. Maybe some people don't have access to one portion of data at all, etc. So that's another thing where it can be helpful. It can also help to track who to give credit to. Just like Mariana was saying now, she knows that the PI was responsible for collecting the data back in the day. So she knows she's the one she can ask about it, but she's also the one who would probably get credit for creating the data. And then finally, the RACI matrix is not just helpful at the team level, but also at the individual level. So if you do this to track all of the things that you have on your desk during the day, as Jill was saying, the director has so many things to do in so many different roles. It also helps to get a sense of realizing, oh, maybe there are some things where I have an opportunity to talk to my team to see if we can split up the workload more evenly. Not all tasks require the same time, not all tasks require the same competency, but maybe we are either missing a person, like a data manager, or we need to find other people in the team who have bandwidth. Another thing I want to mention to Mariana's earlier point, well, what if somebody leaves the team? That is part of the reason why in the RACI matrix, the table we gave you, we didn't put names. We put roles. So the idea is that not the person leaving takes all of the knowledge that is acquired with them, but is the position that it stands in for. And it makes sense to potentially also write that down somewhere in your governance documents. This person who fulfills this position has done these things, and the next person will do that as well. However, as Suzanne was realizing when going through this is not a static product. We fill in the matrix once and then it's true for all eternity. No, it's intended to be a thinking tool to help you think through your processes, gain awareness of your blind spots and maybe that of your team, and see how you can do better as a team iteratively. Next slide, please. Just briefly, because I was saying it can also be used at the individual level, we may all have a lot of things to do simultaneously, a lot of things on our desk. So I mentioned that the RACI matrix can be used to also decrease our workload or manage it a bit more effectively. I encourage you to think about, if that is the case, what are some of the things you may be responsible for that you may no longer need to be responsible for? Is there perhaps a task where you should only be in a consulting role, but you have been doing the main bulk of the work? So who can you collaborate with on that front? Are you actually doing all of the work even though you should just be the person accountable? That's another very common thing. Or perhaps some people who are continuously consulted actually only need to be informed in some circumstances. Side note, when it comes to the informed, that's also very helpful to keep track of for your email communication, not just access rights for data, but also communication at large. Who even needs to have access to what sort of information? Talking about it in this way can also create clarity in the sense that who is going to need to be looped in for what sort of information at what stage, so that we are not all completely overwhelmed with emails. Next slide, please. Some of the terminology that can be helpful. Somebody was saying before, it ends up very confusing. Totally agree. So here are some examples what may help. So I can lead means I can be accountable, and I need XYZ in order to be able to meet this role. I can be responsible, so I can actually get the work done, and I need whatever it is in order to do that. I can advise and I would love to support by doing. That is the consulting role. And then finally, I need to be informed. You could say something along the lines of, I need to know if decisions are made, if the scope of the project changes, etc., in order to sign off or something like that. Any questions? Doesn't look like it. Okay, great. Next slide,
I really like
please.
what you just put up there, by the way. That's a wonderful way to, it's like great idea how you're going to do it, and you gave a pathway, so I appreciate that.
We are always happy to hear what is helpful, because not everything is equally adaptable to different scenarios. So it's always great to hear what resonates. Yeah, and also this is something that can be put down in writing, as I said, in either your policy documents or other types. Next slide, please.
Yeah. So now I will show my example of when I tried to fill in these RACI matrices for eMERGE. So in real life, depending on how you think of these tasks, they may look different, or the roles might look different. So here, this is when I tried organizing the tasks that we went through earlier, assigning roles to data generators. That's like the research assistants who are doing research, the PIs, usually their advisors, and the database team, which is me and a couple others. So when you look at it this way, it looks like the database team is responsible for a lot of things. I think that they're, I think in reality, more of these would also be accountable. Yes, like many of you, I found filling this in challenging, and so it was a useful exercise. So don't take this as the official listing of rules for eMERGE. But it was still a useful thing to think about. But when I tried doing the same thing using a different set of tasks, which I pulled directly from the data policy and tasks that are defined in there, then the matrix looks a lot different. So now it looks like the database team is not responsible for very much, but that's mainly because this data policy was mainly written with the audience of data generators and PIs in mind to help them get clarity on their roles. Whereas like I'm kind of clear on what my own roles are. And so it's maybe not as important to communicate that to everyone else, even though they have, it is a pretty involved set of tasks. So this is a good example of all tasks not being created equally. So organize and maintain the eMERGE DB is a very large task, whereas contact other researchers when using data is just an email. So this really shows that even though it's a useful tool, you have to keep in mind the sort of context in which you're putting this together and the different size of different tasks. So I guess that's it for our slides, and we've got I think 6 minutes left. So if you learned something, please take these ideas back with you to your projects, and whether that's your own project, maybe proposing a data management system for your team as maybe part of your dissertation, or if you're already leading a project, maybe implementing these for your entire project. So I'll pass it to Brett. Oh, I see a question.
So I had a question. I really like the compare and contrast that you gave in terms of here's some general tasks and then here's some specific tasks, and it kind of mapped out a little different. So any advice on really how you go about selecting those rows or the tasks?
Yeah, it's I'm not really sure I have any kind of blanket advice. I mean, my thought process with coming up with these tasks was different than my thought process coming up with these. So this list of tasks was just kind of off the cuff, thinking about what are the main data management tasks, whereas these are more from this data policy, which was developed with an iterative process. So I would say maybe like for large tasks, like organize the database, try to break them down. And for smaller ones that are similar, try to combine them together so that it can be a little bit more clear just from looking at it visually what the distribution of responsibilities is. So.
Just to add, Jill, I think this is also to one of the points you yourself made earlier. Usually we would also do this activity with a team. Obviously, since you're all from different teams or subsections of the teams, this was not something we could translate the same way. So we just gave you the introduction. But as you take it back, we encourage you to do this as a team exercise with different subsections of the team, whatever makes sense. So crowdsource and use the knowledge of the crowd to see what all tasks you come up with and revisit it iteratively. We commonly do that in our team at the beginning of a new project, for example, where it really helps to create a shared understanding also. Hang on, what are all of the tasks that we will need to keep in mind, actually? And you can then also revisit it and add on to it and refine it as you go through the process and the project.
So have like 3 minutes, so don't forget to fill out the feedback survey, which Brett posting in the chat. I think we have, yeah, I guess I'm just seeing. Yeah, I think yeah, we have a couple minutes for Q&A.
I have a question. So we had discussed something about different people having different knowledge about how to make data that is reusable and it can go into perpetuity, right? So essentially using like R script to annotate your analyses versus cutting and pasting in Excel, right? We have researchers who are not familiar at all with R and do not intend to use it, and can't even think about making a jump into GitHub, right? So, how do we deal with that kind of level of um, sort of user familiarity?
Yeah, I think so. Maybe speaking from experience, when I was a new graduate student and had done barely any programming, maybe I'd taken a couple classes or we had a couple specific assignments, but hadn't yet done it in like a research project and had a lot that I didn't know. A lot of it was just kind of like a mental barrier to getting into it. And there were some things that were either helpful or very much not helpful to getting over that. So something that was not helpful was like when I went to like a class and the instructor just expected everyone to already know how to use Git or R or whatever the tool was. So like be patient with your trainees if they have no idea how to use something.
You're assuming these are trainees. I'm talking about like the director.
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
Well, I
I'm
guess
talking about the more upper
so,
level people.
yeah, so the link that I put in the Git slide it's a sort of a landing page that links to a lot of various different videos or text-based tutorials. So yeah, I would say start there and be patient with yourself. And like it may take time, but eventually like I mean it feels so satisfying when you write your first script and you can just click the button and it runs it and reproduces your figure.
I would add, Heidi, because we very often have similar questions in general about collaboration tools, because there is a wide variety out there that can get very elaborate, yet at the same time, we are probably all on a multitude of different teams, and they all have their own set of tools that we need to use, which also means it scales exponentially almost the amount of things we need to manage and we need to learn. So for that reason, one of the things can at least mitigate that challenge a little bit is really creating a team conversation about it. What is the strategy that we want to use as a team and for what reasons? Just to diminish the level of resistance, which is just natural and human for whatever reason that we may have. And then also understanding where the resistance comes from. Is it simply because the person is used to a different set of management tools and is more familiar with that? Is it lack of time? Is it lack of resources to actually learn how this works? Or do they feel like there's potentially even a better solution? And then when you know where the resistance comes from, it also acknowledges why the resistance may be there rather than struggling with the realization, potentially even continuously over time, this is not working the way we want. Because then with that way, you also have the opportunity to identify potential resource people. So in a hypothetical example, if you do have somebody in higher up levels who has not the time resources anymore to keep up with all of the newest developments that are just more and more fast paced, this might be an opportunity for somebody who just joined the team or maybe a junior researcher who does have that time and uses it for other projects to do a training. So you can also learn from one another in unusual configurations, which is a great opportunity for both parties. So I hope this is helpful.
Yeah, thank you very much. not sure it solves my problem, but but
sometimes
I
it-
like this suggestion about, well, sometimes staff can do it for you. I think the problem for the institute comes in when the PIs or the upper level people who are not familiar with using annotations in their code, or not even used to using code, are not going to do it, right? So yeah, I'll have to figure out how we can still make it searchable. Maybe we have to redo the analysis so that it is a reusable code instead of in an Excel spreadsheet, right? Yeah, so we'll have to assign that to someone. Right now, it's just me. I'm like, oh no. And Andy, yeah, thank you, Andy.
if you're if you're pressed for time and you're like this analysis needs to be shared tomorrow and I only know how to use Excel, then even just typing up notes about what you did is still helpful.
Yeah, or what they did. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, this has been very helpful, you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you for sharing all your knowledge and ideas and experiences.
Thank you so much.
There are more questions. We're going to stick around for a few more minutes, so if you have time. And thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.